So hi and welcome to our webinar on simulation debriefing basics. Today we are going to go over the basic theories of debriefing within simulation. We're going to look at some of the best practices. And we're going to go through some of those best practices, and then we're going to formulate some next steps for evaluating your own debriefing. This is designed to be interactive, so at any point you can go ahead and ask any questions you might have. Before we get into it, I wanted to go ahead and just make some basic definitions. So throughout you may hear referenced SBE, which stands for simulation-based education, and that's our vast array of education that involves simulation as our methodology. Faculty is who we refer to as those who are developing, teaching, or facilitating any of the simulation-based education courses. So we just use the broad term faculty throughout this presentation. Our learner, we define those as either clinical or non-clinical persons who are participating in those simulation-based education courses. And then our simulation staff are our simulation center managers, specialists, interns, who are assigned to help support simulation-based education. There's also, if you want to learn more, you can go to the Society for Simulation in Healthcare website, and they have a dictionary that has a vast range of terminologies that you'll come across when working with simulation-based education. So we're going to start at the very beginning, and that's before your course, where you want to go ahead and sort of do before you enter into the course. There's a couple of things that you want to make sure that you are really clear to set yourself up for success when debriefing. So first of all, it's a great idea at the start of a course for the faculty and your simulation staff to go ahead and huddle and discuss any feedback data that you may require throughout the simulation for the simulation staff to capture. We get a lot of feedback from our mannequins, from our audio-visual systems that we're able to record throughout. And it's one thing that the simulation staff are able to do and take that pressure off the faculty to be able to get some hard measurements. So an example is when we intubate our mannequins, it actually has a sensor on the inside that picks up whether they are intubated correctly, whether they are too deep. And CPR is another great example. Our mannequins give us rate, depth, ventilation, volumes, etc. And that is all hard data that we can give back to our learners. But in advance, it's really important that the simulation staff know that these are the data points that you're wanting to capture. So having that two-way conversation before you even begin your debrief, before you even begin your class, really assists in allowing that data to be captured. And you want to make sure you know who is actually going to be leading the debrief for any given scenario. You know, one of the things that can end up happening is that you do have multiple faculty who are there to help, but sometimes you'll end up with too many cooks in the kitchen when it comes to leading the debrief, and that can get you a little off course. So we recommend that you debrief with no more than 2 faculty. And that you assign someone as the co-debriefer and someone as the lead debriefer if you are using multiples. And making sure that everybody understands that even if they are faculty, to take a backseat role if they haven't been assigned to that debriefing role. Now, there's lots of different types of debriefing models out there, and they all consist of sort of 2 parts. The first part is the pre-brief, and then the second part is the debrief. And each of these models that are out there are very similar in their structure. They just call the sections slightly different, and some are a little bit more elaborate than others. But the underpinning theory is all the same throughout them. And that's really to encourage conversation of the learners. And one of the traps that we can fall into with our debriefing is that we go from that conversational mode into our teacher mode, and we start to take over the conversation, and the debriefer's voice becomes the prominent voice in the room, when really it should be the other way around. We really want our learners to have the predominant voice, and we as the debriefers are there to help guide that conversation and facilitate it. So the model that we use here at AHS is called the PEARLS debriefing tool. And so we're going to go through over the course of the next little while and unpack each of these sections and highlight some of the things that we need to keep in the front of our mind. Know that debriefing is both an art and a science. It is something that takes practice. It has structure behind it, but it really does take practice. And one of the best ways to learn to debrief is to watch others debrief or to co-debrief with them. And it's one of these things that we really want to make sure that as we go through, that we are setting both ourselves as the debriefers up for success, but more importantly, that we are setting our learners up for success so that we can indeed meet those course objectives. So the first place that we start is in this first section here with the setting of the scene. This is kind of used in two ways. So we've touched on this twice. So the first time we touch on it is before the simulation even starts. It is critical that we set our learners up for success. So we're going to talk about the pre-brief. And we're going to talk about it in depth because, like anything else, the more time you spend planning, generally the better you have in success. So with the pre-brief, there's a few elements to it. The first one is you want to make sure that when your learners come in, that you make sure that you cover a lot of the logistic of how the day is going to go. So you want to make sure that the learners are clear on what your course objectives are, who is who, so that everybody in the room is introduced, and that means everybody, the learners, the faculty, the simulation staff, that the learners are very clear on who is who and who has what role, who's leading the course, who's going to be their debriefers. And the same goes with the actual sort of structure. What is the agenda of the course? How many simulations are you going to do? How long are you going to be spending on each scenario and each debrief? You know, adult learning theory tells us that adults do better when they know in advance what's going on. And so this is one of these things that we want to make sure that we sort of preempt all of that and give them that information. We want to outline the expectations of that we do want them to participate. We want to outline that the evaluations, so, you know, are they being recorded? How is that recording going to be used? Is this a formal assessment or a summative assessment? You know, is there that pass-fail attached to it, or is this simply to generate some feedback? And generally this section of the class is run by the faculty because they are the ones that know this content sort of, you know, sort of intimately. So that's going to generally take place in the debriefing room or the classroom prior as you get started. You're then going to move on to what's known as the basic assumption. So this comes from the Center for Medical Simulation out of Harvard. They came up with this concept that we believe that everyone participating in activities at Alameda Health System is intelligent, capable, cares about about doing their best, and wants to improve. And the idea of the basic assumption is just that we make the basic assumption that our learners are here to learn and that they are competent. And we also ask that the learners make that basic assumption back that our faculty are here to help facilitate that learning and that no one's here for those gotcha moments. Because unfortunately throughout time, people have had bad experiences with simulation, be it that there was no pre-brief or the debriefs were handled sort of poorly. And so sometimes people come in with baggage. And we want to make sure that we set them up for success, that they know that they're supported, and that we also acknowledge that some people do come in with that baggage with it. So the basic assumption can be sort of spoken about by either the faculty or the simulation staff, and that's something during that pre-huddle that you can kind of talk about who's going to do what, because the roles and responsibilities of the team teaching is just as important as the learners knowing those roles. The next part of the pre-brief is talking about what's known as the fiction contract. And so the fiction contract is where we acknowledge that this is a simulation, that this is done in a simulated environment, and that there will be differences between the clinical environment that they function in every day and what is going on right now in the simulated environment. So we acknowledge that we try and make it as close to their everyday experience as possible within within the constraints of resources and technology. But we also ask that the learners do their part and that they step up and that they go ahead and acknowledge that this is going to be different from their everyday environment because it is a simulated environment, and that we're all aware of that. So that, when you get that buy-in from your learners, you're going to move forwards. I think one of the really good examples that I've had is I once had someone we went through, we did the pre-brief, we talked about the orientation to the space of what they could and couldn't do, and they went ahead and they started the scenario, and we talked about how we wanted them to perform hand hygiene to actually go through and do it, and they started the scenario with, I am washing my hands, and did it in the air and announced what they were doing. But that's how the whole scenario went. They didn't actually do anything. They just announced what they would be doing. And so it took away from that experience. So it was obviously clear that that learner didn't have the buy-in to the simulated environment. So we want to make sure that we acknowledge that to minimize those experiences and get them to actually do what they want to do with it. Once again, this is conducted by either the faculty or the simulation staff. And this really segues into the orientation of the space and the equipment. It's really important that learners know what they can and can't do and what will be different and what will be the same from their everyday clinical environments. So we want to orientate the learners to what they can expect, how we want them to sort of go about those processes. This is often conducted by the simulation staff as we are most familiar with the environment and the features and functionality of the technology, but it can also be done by faculty if they feel confident there. We also do have orientation videos that are available on our intranet site, so you can go to the divisions page, go down to Simulation Center, and you will find videos that you can assign to your learners before they even come in if you are using a particular technology to help get them up to speed so that when you get in the room, they're even more better prepared. So these are the different elements that make up a pre-brief. The sort of the logistics of the course, the basic assumption, the fiction contract, and then the orientation to the space. We are just going to, alrighty, so our next portion is going to be actually during the simulation, how we want to be setting ourselves up for success for the debrief portion. We've set our learners up for success, now we need to continue to set ourselves up for success. So it's really important that the faculty are taking notes on the debriefing points that align to the course objectives. When people walk into the simulation room and they start going, there's a lot going on. Healthcare is a complex system. It's a complex environment. And in simulation, we're able to control some of those factors, be it time, be it reactions, be it, we're able to take away some of the stresses of noise, of, speed, of to accessing different services, etc. And so we're able to kind of take it more from that complex environment and bring it down to a very complicated environment, but it is still complex. And it is still complicated. And so there's a lot going on. And so it's very easy to get off track in a simulation, in a debrief especially, very quickly, that moves away from your objectives of the course. And I think a really good example is you could look at something like a code blue scenario. You could run that scenario with two separate focuses on the course objectives. One way that you could look at it is that you really want to run it around the teamwork aspect of running a code blue. And so you want to focus on were roles assigned? Is there a team leader? How was the closed loop communication when giving medications and things like that? So you could focus on that, and you could have an entire debrief that really focuses around that teamwork and communication. On the flip side, you could run the same scenario with your course objectives being around the ACLS algorithm. Did they give epinephrine every 2 minutes? 3 to 5 minutes. Did they shock every 2 minutes? Were they off the chest for less than 10 seconds? All right, so you could use those as your course objectives. Sometimes it's a combination of both. But you can see that you could have a full conversation about either one of those frames, and it's very easy to get off topic very quickly and go down a separate path that you weren't quite anticipating. So our role as the debriefer is to kind of steer that conversation around what we want our objectives to be and what we want our learners to be focused on. And so it's important that you do take notes on that framework throughout the simulation. And as I said, it gets very complex very quickly. And so sometimes it's really easy to get distracted in the control room when you're observing. And so having some sort of checklist in front of you can really help assist you. And we actually have that built into our templates. At the end, there's a debriefing guide, and it's got the questions, and you're able to actually kind of really dive in and make sure that you are ticking off what you need to be ticking off so you can give that feedback during the debrief. Once again, the simulation staff can assist with that. So be it timing of medications, be it, CPR feedback, intubation, those sort of things. We can help with that. So we need to check in about that at the end of the course, at the end of the scenario. And then most importantly, when you're done with it, when you announce the end of the scenario, you need to let people know that they need to go back to the debrief room. We don't need them cleaning up. That's the role of the simulation staff, is to assist with that. We just need them to go back to the debrief room and get ready to debrief. Know that you do have just a little bit of time. You can take 30 to 60 seconds just to quickly huddle, whether it's with the simulation staff, whether it's with your code debriefers, other faculty, just to get everybody's feedback of like, hey, was there anything critical that you want me to mention during the debrief before going back into the debriefing room? But just know that your learners are going to start to debrief themselves. There's a lot of, there's a lot of anxiety and pressure that builds up around a simulation. And so as soon as it's done, people want to sort of get rid of that. And the way they do it is normally through what I refer to as a verbal diarrhea, where they just want to talk and talk and talk to unpack it all. And so it's really important that you've got this, maybe 30, 60 seconds, and that you just let your learners know, okay, head back to the room, just hold your discussion until everyone's in the room, and then we'll go ahead and start the debrief. Take your 30, 60 seconds to check in with your faculty and sim staff and be like, any feedback? Okay, and just get yourself ready, pull out your debriefing tool, and then head on down into the room itself. You're then going to go ahead and pull out this tool. And this is a great little tool as it gives you some sample phrases. And what you'll do is as you debrief more and more, you're going to focus on different aspects of this structure. And you're going to build up a little sort of repertoire of questions that is going to help, that you can use for any scenario. And it's going to help you guide it along. So where you're going to start is actually resetting the scene that you set in the pre-brief. You're just going to mention that actually, you know what, we were talking about these are our course objectives. You know, we're going to spend 15, 20 minutes, whatever your time allocation is, debriefing about this. We just want to remind everyone that everyone is intelligent and wants to improve, and we acknowledge that. And if there are any major technical difficulties, so for example, halfway through the scenario about a hypoglycemia patient, the mannequin died due to technical issues and they started doing CPR. You want to acknowledge that, saying, hey, look, this was a technical problem. We didn't anticipate that. We know it affected the scenario, and we'll come back to that. But know that you are allowed to acknowledge those things that didn't quite go right on our end as well as their end with it. And then this is going to take maybe 1 minute, 1 sentence, 2 sentences, and then you're going to go in. If you're spending any more than 2 minutes on this little section, you're rambling. And it's really easy to ramble during a debrief. As the debriefer, and sort of we'll give you some strategies to sort of handle that as we go through. Alrighty, so then the next phase that we're going to focus on is really our reactions phase. Once again, this is actually going to be quite a short time, but this is super critical. So the purpose of the reactions phase is really to do a pulse check of your learners, to get a sense of what they're kind of feeling. And that's for both the people who participated in the simulation, and if you had people observing, those who were observing. You want to get a pulse check on everybody. And you can imagine as you get more people in the room, that's going to take longer and longer. So while this is critical, we don't want to spend a lot of time on it. When you ask people, and people have different feelings about this when we use what we call the F word, the feelings word, you know, we want to get that initial reaction and emotion out of the person because if it's one of these things that they think in their mind, they think they did a terrible job, or they're really annoyed at one particular action that someone did or someone said, they're going to get caught up and they're going to perseverate on that. And they're going to think, oh, I did a terrible job. I did a terrible job. I did a terrible job. And that's all they're going to focus on for the next 20 minutes while you talk about during the debrief. And they're not going to be able to make the space for them to actually focus on the conversation. And they're going to be less receptive to any feedback that's given to them. So you want to make sure that you do get their emotions out. But know that they're really quickly going to go into that verbal diarrhea. You're going to ask them, like, how did that feel? How did that go? What any initial reactions? And what you're going to find is someone will go, well, blah, 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 and they'll start going into unpacking the entire thing. And we want to sort of capture it, but contain it at the same time. So my favorite way of doing this is going around the room and saying, can I have one word from you how that went? Can I have one word from you how you're feeling? Can I have one word from you about what your initial reactions are? And so if they start going, good, I thought this is that you can be like, okay, I love it. I love your enthusiasm. Hold that thought and we'll come back to it. We'll make sure we come back to it and make sure that you do come back to that. But you can contain that for the next section. And you'll go, okay, so good is your initial reaction. And the reason that we want to explore this is it really gives us what we call our frame of what the learners, how they view the simulation experience. So different words give you different insights. So if someone says that they're anxious or nervous versus someone else says it was chaotic or confusing, someone says it's great or fantastic, all of those give you little information about, okay, well, this person thought this was a positive experience, or actually this person was incredibly anxious. So how did that affect all the decisions they made during the simulation? And it also can allow you, by polling a lot of people in the room, and ideally everybody in the room if you do have time for it, what it allows you to do is see where are the differences. Did someone say, oh my gosh, that was like tragic? And did someone else say that was fantastic? Because if so, why do you have that dichotomy there? Why do you have a difference between the two? So it helps you to start to organize where are you going to focus your debrief on around some of those emotions with it. So you get a good sense of how the events played out with it. And a good thing to know about, like, if someone is anxious or stressed or nervous, just know that they may have held back in the simulation, because they're probably not anxious or nervous about the content. They're anxious or nervous about being in a simulation itself. And that's going to have influenced everything with it. So they're the big things that you want to focus on in this section. I think the other thing to really think about here is that we want to make sure that as we're sort of capturing people's emotions, that we do come back to them, that we do circle back to it. And know that sometimes simulations can be triggering. We don't know what people's experiences are outside of, the moment that we're in. And so you don't know what someone's dealing with at home. You don't know what they're dealing with at work. You may run a scenario that's a trauma of a child, and they may have been on shift last week, and they may have been involved in a trauma with a child, and it may have been traumatic for them. It may not have gone well. It may have been messy, and they're still unpacking that. And then suddenly they're put in another situation. And when you ask them, how did that go? You may not only get the reactions from what happened in the sim room, but you may get the extra baggage that people bring in and their life experiences. So just be aware that sometimes you will get tears. Sometimes people get really mad. Sometimes, they're really, really excited. So you do get a lot of emotion throughout this. And part of your role as the debriefer is to help contain that, to keep it on track with the objectives, but at the same time to be a human and to acknowledge that people are having these big reactions. So sometimes it is appropriate as you get further down into this, if you've got someone who's, pretty upset, it may be appropriate to ask them, do they want to step out and take a moment and come back in? Knowing that also sometimes it's worthwhile, you may need to circle back with that person afterwards because you may not have that space to be able to, and no resources that you can send people to, because we're educators, we're not therapists. And so knowing things like the employee assistance program, that you're able to, direct people there to assist with that extra help that they may need. So this gives you a window into that. This gives you a little bit of a precursor that more emotions may be coming out throughout the debrief and help you prepare. It also is really good to be able to refer back to as you go through. So the reactions phase is really important, but as I said, you want to keep it nice and short. The next one is going to be the description phase. And so this is really designed to clarify the facts for everybody, both the learners and the faculty. And what we want to do with this is we want to go through and have a summary of all the events that occurred during the simulation. As I said, this can be complex. There can be a lot of things going on, and sometimes you miss what people say. Sometimes you miss that they actually did an assessment that you were looking for and you didn't tick off on your list, but in fact they did do it, and other people sort of picked up on that. But at other times, they may have missed key piece of information. So I think a really good example I have of that is we ran one scenario that was that we get the handoff to one person, and in the handoff we mentioned basically that there was a potential this patient could have opiates on board. And so everyone during the scenario was really, really confused as to why this patient wasn't doing well and why they weren't responding to any of the interventions. And then right at the end, the person who had received the original handoff had said, oh, let's give Narcan. And everyone went, okay, sure. And they gave Narcan, and that was what we were looking for, and everything started to resolve. We called this scenario, and we went into the debrief, and there were a lot of people who were really confused because there was only one person who received that information, and they never passed it on to anyone else. So during this description phase, we were able to have that person say, well, you know, I got the handoff that opiates might be on board. And you saw the whole room go, oh, okay, and make more sense. So, you know, it really allows us to see where there's maybe some misinformation that has been generated. And it helps to set you up for a sequence of events for your debriefing. And once again, this should be shorter, but you're going to spend a little bit of time here because it's going to be dependent on your scenario as to how much time the sequence is going to take. You know, if it was a 5 to 10 minute communication scenario, it's going to look different than if it was a 20-minute polytrauma scenario with it. Alrighty, so our next phase that we're going to look at is where you're going to spend the bulk of your time. In terms of how long an actual debrief should be, the literature kind of used to say that it should be 2 to 3 times longer than your scenario. So if your scenario is 10 minutes, you should debrief for 20 to 30 minutes. You know, later discussions around that have kind of come out and said, well, that's kind of just what someone said was a good time length, and there's not necessarily science behind that is a good amount of time to debrief for. But you do definitely want to leave a decent amount of time to debrief, but it's also going to look different. If you're debriefing a in situ simulation, it's going to look very different to if you're debriefing in the simulation center because of the logistics around it. So where you're going to spend the bulk of your time is going to be in the analysis phase. And this is where you really want to unpack all those performance domains that are going on. And there's a couple of ways that you can do this, and know that this is kind of your role in here is to guide this and to help unpeel the onion, because it's a lot of layers to a lot of the things they talk about, and people initially just go to that surface answer, and it's your job to dive deeper with it. So actually with the Pearls debriefing tool, it's a 2-page tool. So one page has the structure of the whole debrief, and then on the other side, they go into more detail about the analysis phase. So they talk about all the different performance domains. So situational awareness, teamwork, leadership, communication, the actual technical skills, and then kind of that critical thinking and that decision making that go into it. From there, there's a few different approaches that you can go for, and they provide some sample phrases for that. So know that one of the big skills that gets used here is what's called advocacy and inquiry. So advocacy is where you advocate for what you observed, and then the inquiry is asking, can you tell me more? And Dr. Jenny Rudolph, who's out of CMS out of Harvard, she tells this amazing story about how, she really talks about that you need to debrief with, good judgment, that we have to assume that our learners are actually there to learn and that they mean the best. And she tells this amazing story about how they ran a scenario. It was in one of the old hospital OR suites, where they had the observation rooms above. And so it was perfect for doing an in situ simulation because everyone could stand up. They had a bird's eye view over the scenario. And she had a nurse, I think it was a nurse, who was going in, who she knew was not a big fan of simulation. And so she had that conversation during the pre-brief, being like, we'd love you to engage, and then during the scenario, they were doing a mass transfusion protocol. During the scenario, Dr. Rudolph noticed that this one particular person sort of retreated out of the simulation and just was standing kind of over to the side. And, her first reaction was, she's not even participating, and it's bringing that sort of bias into it. So as she went into the debrief, Dr. Rudolph made sure that she sort of checked that bias at the door, and she went for that advocacy inquiry approach. And she was like, so I noticed that during the mass transfusion that you took a step back and you were standing to the side. So that's the advocacy. And she was like, I think that, I thought that was kind of strange. So she was letting her know that it was a good or a bad thing. So that's all the advocacy. And then she went ahead with the inquiry and she said, so can you explain to me what your thought process was, what was going on? And this nurse sort of then opened up and said, well, I noticed that every single person was breaking sterile technique and they were contaminating all the instruments. And so I went and stood in front of the only sterile instruments left so that when the mass transfusion was done and under control, we could continue with the surgery. And it was one of those moments where apparently everyone in the room kind of went, huh, okay, that wasn't a learning objective. It was not something anyone else had thought of. But I bet you now every time those people who are involved in that are in some sort of emergency situation, it's in the back of someone's mind to think about, okay, what about our sterile, technique to then move forwards afterwards. And it was, such a powerful moment. So using that advocacy inquiry can really allow people to open up where maybe otherwise they wouldn't open up in the same way. So stating what you saw, is it a good or a bad thing? Do you think it's a good or a bad thing? And then asking, can you explain to me what was going on? You're also going to sort of, during this time, you're going to want to ask prompting questions. So you're going to ask a question and someone might be like, you might say, okay, what did people do well? And someone will be like, oh, it was good teamwork. That's then your cue to come back and say, well, what was good about it? And go ahead and push back. Because we want to actually make sure that we get more information. And then the person is probably going to come back with, well, I really liked how someone did such and such. So you want to really make sure that you keep asking the questions to get specific reasons why people are saying what they're saying. You also don't want to play the guess what I'm thinking game when you ask a question. So and the advocacy really inquiry mode allows you to really do that. So you don't want to kind of be asked that leading question of like, I have an answer that I want you to get to that's around the objectives. And so I'm going to ask the question, but not actually say what I'm asking the question about. So advocacy inquiry helps to sort of reduce that. And then you also want to make sure that throughout this, that you ask your question, you ask it once and then you stop and wait. Silence is golden in this. People take time to form answers. Count to 10 in your head before you ask the question again. Sometimes what we do is we go into okay, I'm going to ask the question, and then actually I'm going to re-ask the same question in a slightly different way. I'm still not going to give you a chance to answer, and I'm going to ask it again. Okay, now I'll give you time to answer. Okay, no one answered, so I'm going to ask again. So make sure you leave space for people and seriously, just count to 10 in your head before you ask that next question. Get comfortable with the silence, and that takes time. And just know this whole analysis phase takes time, practice, time, and practice. This is where it's really critical to make sure that they're the ones doing the talking, not you. You're there to guide with it. So then we move into our final phase, which is our application and summary. And I think with this, we really shortchange this in a lot of ways. And so we don't spend enough time here. We kind of realize, oh, I've got to move on to the next scenario, or, oh, it's lunchtime, and we're like, okay, let's wrap it up. What's our summary? But really the purpose of this is to really solidify those new mental models that people have created throughout this debrief and throughout the simulation process. So we do want to make sure we do leave a good chunk of time to go in and talk about this. And when you're getting people, one thing that I like to ask is like, what is going to be one thing you're going to do differently on your next shift? It helps people to be specific about what they're actually going to do. What's that one thing they can walk away with? so that you get answers like, you know, before knocking on a patient's door, I'm going to take a breath and remind myself to perform gift as I enter. You know, what's that one tangible thing that they're going to do, rather than be like, oh, I'm going to do good communication. Like the analysis phase, we want this to be specific with it, and that can kind of be hard. But yeah, leave yourself time for this. So then after the course, there's still a little bit of work to be done. And first of all, debriefing with the sim staff is a good place to start. And you can kind of talk about any of those technical issues that happen, but also kind of, was there anything that the sim staff saw that maybe should be different, and vice versa. And just know that there's this great tool, and we have it available in the Sim Center, and we're happy to help support you with this. It's called the Dash tool, and it actually comes out of CMS again. And it is a rating tool that allows us to give feedback to the debriefer. So debrief the debriefer. And it breaks it up into all these different elements that we've kind of discussed today, and allows us to help you grow as a debriefer. So I can send you this information afterwards, and it's also available on our intranet page with it. Know that when you're doing in situ simulations that it's going to be different. And so with in situ simulations, people scatter very quickly. They're being pulled from their clinical duties. We pause them to do the simulation, and then the simulation's done, and they're going to want to get straight back to those clinical duties. So you're going to have limited time. You have to go fast. And know that it's going to be focused more on the systems and than necessarily on sort of the performance of the individual. And the Pearls actually has a tool designed for this that does kind of change that a little bit. So just know that it will look different. So I want to make sure that you have access to some of the best practices and the resources out there. So on our intranet side, we actually collate a lot of this information, and we make it nice and accessible for you. On there, we actually have examples of pre-briefing and debriefings that you can actually go watch and sort of see how it's modeled. We have links to the INACSL standards of best practice, which include debriefing, but it is simulation design, right from simulation designs to operations and everything in between. There's the Pearls debriefing tool that we have available in the Simulation Center for you to use, and we're happy to coach you in more depth. There's the Dash tool as well that I was talking about, and we're happy to do those evaluations with you and make some time afterwards to actually go through and give you that feedback of where maybe some of the areas you need to kind of focus on. And know that you're going to remind yourself every time you do this that, oh, I got to focus on this. Oh, I forgot to, you know, really be great about my pre-brief, or actually, you know, I forgot about the reactions phase completely. Know that every time you look at it, there's going to be something that you're going to remind yourself about. And then finally, we have a link on the intranet page to a debriefing podcast. It's about 25 minutes in length. And it will cover everything you need to know. Well, not everything, but close to everything you need to know about debriefing in 25 minutes. I don't know how they do it. It's an amazing podcast, and it's a great reminder to kind of get yourself in a good headspace. So listening to it on the way to, you know, on the way to work, or when you're having those reflection moments. So once again, that's a tool that's on, and there's a lot of podcasts out there that allow you to kind of grow your knowledge with it. So as I said, we do have example videos on the intranet page. And with this, I really encourage you to go through and note the different phases. Have the debriefing tool in front of you as you watch it, and kind of, or use the Dash tool and evaluate them. There's also a lot of examples on YouTube that you can go ahead and look up, and that's a way that you can practice your debriefing in between actually doing debriefs, because we know that with sometimes when you're faculty for simulation, you may be in the Sim Center for, you know, a month or two running lots of classes, and then we may not see you for 6 months. And so you come back after 6 months and you're like, oh, what am I doing again? How do I debrief? We know that it slips out. And so this is a way that you can refresh yourself, and we're happy to discuss further. You can reach out to us at simulation@alamedahealthsystem.org at any time.